Mr. Minister, distinguished research team, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Evaluation Department of NORAD, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the seminar where we officially launch the report and discuss the report of the evaluation of the Norwegian peace efforts in Sri Lanka. The foremost purpose of evaluation is to learn what works, learn what doesn't work, and what we can do better. The evaluation of Norwegian peace efforts in Sri Lanka is probably one of the first major published independent evaluations of peace diplomacy involving a third-party government facilitator. Given the role of Norway often plays as a facilitator in conflict situations, this is a unique possibility for reflection. What can we learn from the experience of the Norwegian peace efforts in Sri Lanka during the period 1997 to 2009? What, if anything, could have been done differently? What was the understanding that Norway, as a facilitator, had of the conflict? These are some of the questions that are examined in the evaluation. It is a complicated task. Complicated because there is no counterfactual. There is no Sri Lanka where Norway was not involved as a facilitator. Complicated also because of the closeness or nearness in time. History is still being written as we speak. I would like to take this opportunity to mention, for those of you who may not be aware of this, that the Evaluation Department in NORAD has a separate mandate that makes it responsible for initiating independent evaluations of activities financed over the Norwegian aid budget and reports to the Secretary General of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The seminar today consists of two parts. The first hosted by the Evaluation Department, which includes the presentation of the report by the principal researcher, Gunnar Sorbo, and which is followed by commentary by the Minister of the Environment and International Development, Erik Solheim. The second part of the seminar is hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and includes a distinguished panel, a questions and answers session, and closing remarks by Dr. Sorbo and Minister Solheim. I'd like you to also note that we will not open up for questions to the research team after their presentation, but that questions to the team can be made during the Q&A session after the panel. So please remember your questions to the research team. And now, without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Gunnar Sorbo, Dr. Gunnar Sorbo, team leader for the evaluation.
Let me begin by expressing my appreciation for the support received from the Ministry during this difficult and complex study, and our gratitude to NORAD for being chosen to undertake this assignment, which was also very inspiring, and for this opportunity to present our report in the presence of Erik Solheim, a very distinguished panel, and what I take to be a concerned audience. This presentation will, at this moment, be posted at the CMI website, cmi.no. Monday morning quarterback is a term which is very familiar to Richard Armitage. It's a common American expression. A Monday morning quarterbacker is someone who, after the event, offers advice or criticism concerning decisions made by others from a position of hindsight. The Norwegian word for this is etterpåklokskap. I'm saying this at the beginning of this presentation because Erik Solheim, at our first meeting on this evaluation, told me that he was not interested in etterpåklokskap. I hope I can quote you on this. In a sense, I guess all evaluations contain elements of Monday morning quarterbacking. After all, we know what happened in Sri Lanka, and we may all see things more clearly or in a different light now. We may wish we did some things differently, which would not be surprising. Rather, the opposite would be very surprising, that we have no regrets and no self-criticism. I think there is a difference, though, between the unfolding of unpredictable events that could not be foreseen. And on the other hand, long-term features of the Sri Lankan political system, or the economy, or the role of NGOs in Sri Lankan society, for example, where knowledge is and was available, and where we would expect that a facilitator or anybody else intervening in Sri Lankan affairs would command such knowledge as the basis for making hopefully sound decisions. In this report, we try to make this distinction and hope not to be accused of just being a bunch of Monday morning quarterbackers who are privileged to be researchers who do not have to make fast decisions at the spur of the moment, although, of course, we are acutely aware of the difficult decisions that had to be made in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka also there were many unexpected events. The ways in which 9/11 finally played out, the split within the LTTE, the so-called Karuna split, the tsunami, the Rajapaksa's marginal victory. But there were also patterns and structures, and some of them were old tricks in the Sri Lankan book. So there was no excuse for not anticipating them or for lacking a strategy to deal with them. So while we appreciate the enormous challenges Norway faced in Sri Lanka, and of course also the challenges faced by domestic actors to the conflict, there was also often time enough. In fact, at one point in October 2004, a staff member of the Norwegian embassy, in frustration but with also a sense of humor, wrote a memo back to Oslo with the title "Waiting for Godot." A few words about what happened in Sri Lanka. Norway first officially offered to help facilitate a peace process between the government and the LTTE in 1991. In May 1999, 8 years after, President Chandrika Kumaratunga and the LTTE formally invited Norway. After a difficult start, a new government with Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister and with considerable Norwegian assistance and international support signed a ceasefire agreement with the LTTE. It was a major achievement. It saved lots of lives, it created hope as well as economic progress. A Nordic force was deployed to monitor the ceasefire, the Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission. 6 rounds of talks were held, but problems related to the ceasefire agreement, which in itself had some weaknesses, to the organization of aid for the LTTE controlled areas, and a proposal from the LTTE regarding an interim administration for the Northeast led to the LTTE suspending its participation in the process in April 2003. From then on, and despite Norwegian efforts, the process was largely stalled, and for many different reasons which we will come back to, the parties went to war again in 2006. On 17th of May 2009, the Sri Lankan army brought about the final defeat of the LTTE, and a very large number of innocent people were killed, ending also in humanitarian catastrophe. The Norwegian peace facilitation continued throughout this period, although of course taking on different roles, as the peace process died in 2006. During the very last phase, Norway played a very active role, trying to secure humanitarian access and save lives with the US, the UN, and the ICRC. Unfortunately, these efforts failed. This means that during Norway's long engagement, peace talks were relatively brief. There was a long germination period to talks, and then a lot of time attempting to get them to the table, which itself shows Norway's perseverance as well as patience. The main purpose of this evaluation is to learn from the Norwegian experience as facilitator in Sri Lanka. It has a wider purpose than just evaluating what happened there. It has supposed to have implications more broadly for peacemaking and for Norway's peace diplomacy. We are telling the story. We are trying to interpret and discuss the choices made by Norway, to assess the Norwegian understanding and the achievements, to provide recommendations, and hopefully also to contribute to the international debate on conflict resolution. As the head of the evaluation department said, there were many challenges also in terms of methodology. The issue of counterfactual history has been made. Whether a different Norwegian strategy would have resulted in a different outcome is impossible to prove. The issue of access is another one. The team was not able to gain access to a number of key people. The government did not want to talk and refused to grant a visa for us to visit Sri Lanka. The LTT leadership is either dead or in prison. And of course we recognize these limitations, although 2 team members to some extent remedied this inability because of earlier research where they have interviewed some key people involved with the peace process. We also managed to interview a number of people when they left Sri Lanka to go abroad, either here in Oslo or elsewhere on the European continent and in the United States. Just very briefly on the way we have approached this. We try to expose ourselves, the steps we make, so that whatever we are criticized for, it's open, it's there, it's easy to attack us if we have weaknesses. And what we are trying to do is that we combine what we call an inside-out approach, a detailed account of Norway's involvement in the peace process since 1990, with an outside-in approach, seeing it in the broader context on the conflict and the peacemaking dynamics. And then we try, which is different from some of the other studies that we have seen, we try very deliberately to construct the linkages between the inside and outside approach. And we identify a number of key turning points which mark key moments of change and had profound impact also on Norway's room for maneuver as a peace facilitator. Things like April 2003 when LTT suspended their participation in talks, like the Karuna split in March 2004, the tsunami, of course, and so on. We also have to assess Norwegian efforts against the claims being made. What are the claims being made by Norway? Is there a self-evaluation which we can use? I don't have time to go into this, but based on interviews, archives, and so on, I think the Norwegian official story is in very brief terms. It's unfair, I know it, but still, Norway, the story is that Norway put in great efforts, some say honest efforts, but definitely great efforts. There were important achievements, but the process failed because of domestic politics in Sri Lanka and other external factors which were beyond the control of Norway. There are, of course, other critical claims or critical stories. In Sri Lanka, in Colombo, Norway has often been portrayed in very negative terms, particularly in Sri Lankan media, being accused of meddling in domestic affairs, helping to legitimize the LTT, and generally having a Tamil bias. These are our main findings. Number one, it was a combination of factors which undermined the peace process. The reform resistance of both parties, particular features of Sri Lanka's political culture, international shifts, and contingent events. Also, the collapse of talks and the subsequent military victory were as much a story of the LTT losing as of the government winning or the Norwegians failing. I will try to explain this. Almost all of Norway's achievements occurred during the Wickremesinghe government. There was a unique constellation of factors and events. There was a hurting stalemate, as we call it, on the battleground. There was an economic crisis which had to be addressed. There was the election of a UNP-led coalition on a peace ticket with a strong pro-West, pro-liberalization agenda. This constellation of factors provided an important entry point for Norway. It turned out not to last for very long, for different reasons, domestic as well as international. But in our view, it was right of Norway to enter this peace process. There was a window of opportunity, a serious one. It could have succeeded. First, the problem Ranil Wickremesinghe, the Prime Minister, was unable to sell the peace process to the Sinhalese population. The economy recovered after the ceasefire agreement, growth rates rose, inflation fell, but people still felt squeezed. When he lost the next election, and barely so, I must say, people were not necessarily voting against liberalization of the economy, but against a leader who did not manage to make the right kind of populist gesture, if I could use that word. The second point, the factors that were conducive for the start of the peace process did little to change the underlying structures. There is no time here to go into details on this, but a peaceful solution was not only dependent on an agreement between the government and the LTTE, but also an agreement between the two dominant political parties, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the United National Party. That the conflict could not be solved militarily and that there was a need for a political package involving devolution of power and state reform. And during the 90s, and this is the window of opportunity, a common understanding emerged, but unstable coalition governments, a miserable relationship between Ranil and Chandrika, and the growing strength of the ethno-nationalist parties JVP and JHU made it impossible to stick to it. The pattern of southern opposition parties playing the ethnic card became a central destabilizing factor, combined with the inter-party and interpersonal rivalry between Chandrika and Ranil. This is important. Any move forward had to start by neutralizing the possibility of party political destabilization in the south. Instead, it was decided that the president could be kept on the fringe, thus allowing Ranil Wickremesinghe to dominate. This was clearly a mistake. It also became a problem which the Norwegians tried to do something about, that the Muslim population felt sidelined by the peace process. My third point, the LTTE was also reform resistant. There is no indication that Prabhakaran, the LTTE leader, was committed to an alternative to Tamil Eelam. And while this may not be true for Balasingham, who mediated the contact with Norway, he probably had less authority than some of us would like to believe. Sinhalese critics claimed that the LTTE were simply using the ceasefire as an opportunity to regroup, rearm, and generally prepare themselves for a final conclusive fight. The LTTE argument was that they had to keep their military strength based on their earlier experience with the governments in Colombo who did not honor agreements. But what we do know is that the Oslo communique, when in the Oslo communique in December 2002, federalism was introduced as an arrangement to explore, we know that there was backtracking on both sides. So what might have become a springboard, also for the Norwegian facilitators, turned out to be a bridge too far. My fourth and very important point in this, shifts in the international environment, the changing role and interests of key international players influenced Norway's role and shaped the peace process more generally. Both parties, the government and the LTTE, wanted to internationalize the process, but with different motivations. Ranil Wickremesinghe needed to do so because of the economic crisis, because of his own views on economic reforms, and because he thought that economic aid to the LTTE-controlled areas and development would make the Tigers more accepting of a political solution within a unitary state. The LTTE was also keen on receiving aid for development and rehabilitation and wanted legitimacy post 9/11 and attention as well. The donor community pledged large amounts of aid to both parties, conditional on progress, but there were no mechanisms for securing compliance, and aid became caught up in the politics of the peace process. It became increasingly difficult for foreign players to deal with the LTTE, which came on the list of terrorist organizations in an increasing number of countries, not just because of the war on terror, but also because some of their actions could not be tolerated any longer. The assassination of Kadergamar in August 2005 was particularly hard to swallow for the international community. And in 2006, Canada and the European Union were the last major Western actors and donors, except for Norway, banning the LTTE. This left Norway increasingly exposed as the sole conduit to the LTTE, contributing to the notion as well in Sri Lanka that Norway was biased. It also had very negative effects on the Sri Lanka monitoring mission because the monitors from the Nordic EU countries were asked to leave by the LTTE, leaving Norway alone with Iceland. India also increasingly distanced itself from the struggle for Tamil Eelam, which, by the way, they had never accepted, just as they never approved of the LTTE. One reason, of course, being the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. As Narayan Swamy writes in his book, The Tiger Vanquished, the murder of Rajiv Gandhi ultimately cost the LTTE its Tamil Eelam and Prabhakaran his life. When Rajapaksa came to power, there was also increasing Indian concern about Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka. As one Indian observer told us, when the war started, it was led by Indian silence. And while Rajapaksa framed his operations within the discourse on war of terror, he very cleverly constructed his own international safety net with an eastwards tilt and with China in a prominent position and diluted Western influence and leverage. The international dimensions of the peace process also had a number of effects in the South. It all played into the hands of nationalists, undermined the legitimacy of Ranil, led to attacks on NGOs, which received support from Norway and other donors, and generally gave space to political entrepreneurs to mobilize and recycle old insecurities. As a final point, we must mention the role of contingent or unpredictable events, particularly the Karuna split, the split within the LTTE, which took place in March 2004. It was one of the most important turning points. It came at a level which was not expected. And it weakened the movement and, very importantly, tilted the military balance in favor of the Sri Lankan army. So this story is not just a story about political shifts, it's also a story about war-making capabilities changing. And then, of course, the tsunami, hitting hard in December 2004. It provided still a last chance for the peace process, where the Norwegians tried very hard and they helped putting together an arrangement for the provision of aid, which might have been the beginning of a new rapprochement, but which was undermined by the opposition parties in the south and the Muslims who were worried about becoming dominated by the LTTE and annulled finally by the Supreme Court. From then on, we started moving towards the final war. Our assessment of the Norwegians' role is this. Norway could do little to change or influence the forces at stake in war and the changing international context in which it took place. Norway became increasingly exposed. There was not the same international burden sharing as there had been in the beginning when the peace process was going. And it was used by domestic and international parties who found it convenient for Norway to continue its role while silently accepting that the Sri Lankan government pursued a war for peace. Domestic ownership, which was an important aspect, and rightly so, for the Norwegian facilitation, became also a challenge because the owners changed and had different opinions about peace and how to get there. There were also problematic exclusions, also recognized by the Norwegian ministry. Chandrika, as I said, was sidelined. The Norwegian team tried to brief her regularly. She was still the president. They tried to brief her regularly about developments, but did not see it as their mandate to get the dialogue going between the two main parties. It became more important to keep the momentum than to secure broader support, obviously, as Erik Solheim has expressed today in Morgenbladet, a dilemma. Today we can say it was poor judgment. We will never know if an alternative strategy would have succeeded, but it became the Achilles heel of the peace process and was a major reason for its downfall. And it was predictable. Central to Norway's approach to ownership was also the notion of impartiality. Maintaining impartiality in a conflict which became more and more asymmetric is not straightforward, however. Combined with a defendable idea that Norway should help build LTTE's capacity to engage in negotiations, also in order to transform the movement, this provoked accusations of anti-state bias and Tamil bias in Colombo. We believe, therefore, that the stronger and clearer conditions for engagement should have been negotiated from the start. Another challenge turned out to be Norway's multiple roles and the tensions between them, as pragmatic peace facilitator, as transparent monitor, as prominent donor, particularly providing aid to Sri Lankan NGOs to support the peace process, which turned out to come at a cost when the owners changed, and a principled humanitarian actor. And tensions particularly grew when the war re-escalated. The role of being monitor was to a large extent pushed upon Norway, because it was not accepted by the parties to have any other forces than the Nordic forces. We devote a separate chapter on the SLMM in our report on the strength and the weaknesses of it. Again, it was a bit affected by these tensions. I don't have time to move into this here, but if there are questions later. In April 2001, Erik Solheim pronounced, "In Lanka Academic, there was a story. Ask Erik." Questions and answers. And Erik Solheim said, "If one day we become convinced that one side or both are not serious and only use our efforts as a cover for fooling the world, we will discontinue our efforts." In 2006, 5 years after, a withdrawal was discussed by the Norwegian team. And as well, the issue of becoming a pawn in Sri Lankan politics, particularly expressed from the Norwegian embassy in Colombo. It was decided to stay because the ground situation might change and because Norway had special access which might help mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the war that had started. This, in our view, is an understandable decision. However, a Norwegian withdrawal as official facilitator would not have changed events in any major way. But it would have clarified the situation and sent a clear signal both to domestic and international parties, both of whom had used Norway to displace pressure and accountability. And to have pulled back would not have precluded keeping channels open, including with the LTTE. It would not mean that Norway would wash its hands of Sri Lanka. And on-demand mediation might still have been possible if it had come to that. But even more importantly, the peace process contributed to a transformation of Sri Lanka's political landscape. It played a role, along with other forces, in facilitating a power shift in which what we might call ultranationalism moved from the margins to the center of Sri Lankan politics. There were lots of intervening variables. We are trying to make this argument, it's a complex one. I beg you not to take it in a simple way. There were lots of intervening variables. There were contingent factors, there were international trends, there were longer-term patterns in relation to singular nationalism, but the peace process also helped fuel a nationalist backlash. We believe, therefore, that ethical issues surrounding such a transformation and its consequences should have been in the forefront of a Norwegian discussion on withdrawal. After all, peace efforts are about life and death, and to have noble intentions are not enough. The Ministry has communicated to us that such issues were indeed on the table continuously, but it's not so much reflected in the archives, which are rich, by the way, nor from the interviews we held. So our point is we need to be keenly aware of the potential for interventions to unintentionally do harm. Mike, before I have very few concluding remarks, I will say a few words. What's in the title of this report? Pawns or Peace? It's not what you think. It's necessary to explain the title. As some of you will know, but not all of you, there are pawns and pieces on a chessboard. In Norwegian, the term for a pawn is bonde. First, this highlights that external interveners are never neutral referees, but active players in the peace process. And secondly, pawns tend to be minor rather than game-changing players, but they can also become significant players at certain moments in the game. When power is evenly balanced, they can tip the game in one direction or another. Another meaning of the term is someone being used to further the purposes of others. We believe that this metaphor is a useful way to look at Norway's role. There is a danger that those who intervene in conflict write scripts for themselves, which may tend to inflate their importance and influence, and our analysis supports what is obviously true, that peace must be made primarily by domestic actors who take the risks and bear the costs of peacemaking. My concluding sentences are the following. Norway played a serious and sustained role in the Sri Lankan peace process and can in no way be held primarily or solely responsible for the failure to bring about a peaceful solution. Norway could do little to influence the many different forces at stake in the war and the changing international context in which it took place. Under the circumstances, it is difficult to imagine how a different mediator or a different approach would have done better. However, there were weaknesses, as we have discussed, and it is our assessment, and here the Norwegian term would be skjønn. It is our assessment that Norway should have withdrawn earlier. There are also several broader lessons to be learned from the Sri Lankan experience, and we discuss such lessons at the end of our report, which deals, for example, with the role of aid, the role of non-state actors, power asymmetries, the war on terror, and not least the new global powers, particularly China, and the implications for international peace efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation.